Hey y'all, welcome to City Planning Poetics 10, Urban Futures. I'm Davy Knittle. I want to start by thanking some folks. Several folks are operating. The term that occurs to me is behind the scenes, but I guess it's kind of a silly term to make this happen today. So I want to thank Heidi and Anthony and Leah and Sophia, who are doing lots of work to make this possible. I'm so excited to be joined by CHRISTINA JACKSON and Asali Solomon. I'm going to provide a kind of longish introduction. Asali and CHRISTINA are each going to present for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to have a Q&A. And so if you have questions during or after the presentations, if you put them in the YouTube chat, we'll be able to see them and can respond to them. So thanks so much for being here, and let's get started. So 6 years ago this week, I visited Penn as a prospective graduate student. While it was my first visit to the campus, in which I imagined it as a potential workplace, the physical spaces of Penn were by no means unfamiliar to me. On my way to the Kelly Writers House to meet with Writers House director Jessica Lowenthal, I stood outside the house looking at Covenant, the Alexander Lieberman sculpture just west of the Writers House on Locust Walk. I remembered playing around that sculpture, trying to climb its sides 25 years or so previous as a preschooler at the Parent Infant Center at 42nd and Locust. When I met with Jessica on that day in March of 2015, she invited me to organize a reading series at the Writers House. Eventually, I came up with the idea for the series, but Jessica actually came up with the name. This series, City Planning Poetics, which began in February of 2016 with a conversation between social policy scholar and urbanist Amy Hillier and poet and essayist Jenna Osman, was imagined as an opportunity for writers and scholars with shared commitments to urban studies, but different disciplinary vocabularies to be in conversation. It was always imagined as a 10-event series, and so today's conversation is the final installment. The series, which has been a total joy to curate, is one example of what the hard work and commitment of the folks at the Kelly Writers House makes possible. In this final event in this series, before I introduce Asali Solomon and CHRISTINA JACKSON, with whom I am honored to close the series, I want to spend a moment thanking everyone at the KWH for all of their work to make this series possible over the past 5 years. Dozens of undergraduate student staff members over the years set up chairs, tested microphones, and ran audio. They fielded questions on the YouTube feed and put together beautiful receptions. Heidi Kalu and Ali Katz worked to make the logistics of the events possible. Andrew Beal and Sean Collins processed honoraria for speakers. Kenna O'Rourke patiently listened to me ramble enthusiastically about forthcoming events in the series on many occasions. Zach Cardner single-handedly saved several events that were compromised by tech malfunctions that he magically solved. And finally, Jessica Lowenthal scheduled, and in several cases rescheduled, all 10 events in this series. Jessica brainstormed with me about folks to invite and ways to collaborate with other programs at the Writers House. Jessica, you gave me not only the opportunity to run this series, but also logistical and curatorial support for every single event over the past 5 years. City Planning Poetics has been less my project and more a collaboration between us. You are my model for how kind and logistically savvy and community-oriented it is possible to be as a person managing the mechanics of public programs. I've learned so much from you. I can't thank you enough. So the theme of this final event in this series is urban futures. But as I thought about folks to invite, the conversation I realized I wanted to have was really with folks who think seriously about what an equitable future for Philadelphia might be like. So as a nearly lifelong Philadelphian, I am thrilled to host urban sociologist CHRISTINA JACKSON and novelist Asali Solomon, two other nearly lifelong Philadelphians whose work I have long admired. Their thinking with and about Philadelphia, among a range of other cities, has been so generative for me as a model of how to ask questions of urban space that at once articulate individual experiences of cities and manifest methods for anti-racist systemic critique. In an early scene in Asali's 2015 novel, Disgruntled, we read the thoughts of the protagonist, Kenya Curtis, who in this moment in the novel is finishing elementary school and will soon become one of a very small number of Black students at a nearly all-white private school on the main line. In this scene, Kenya recalls her mental map of 40th Street, near where her mother works as a librarian at the Walnut West branch of the Free Library of Philadelphia, as it relates to the street on which Kenya lives a few blocks further west. Asali writes, quote, Kenya loved being on 40th Street near the Penn campus. She loved the trees and the busyness of it, the food trucks, the jewelry vendors, Marty's Discount, where she sometimes got small toys or a soda, the students playing Frisbee on the lawn behind her mother's library. Though it was nothing like her block, all black and fairly quiet, with its aluminum-sided fronts and nearly half a mile away, she liked to think of it as part of her neighborhood. As she moves through the West Philadelphia of the late 1980s, Kenya's mental map joins the space of the Penn campus and the commercial corridor of 40th Street to her own block further west. Asali offers a detailed description of Kenya's mental map of the neighborhood and its shifts in sonic landscape, building type, and use. On 40th Street, Kenya straddles the forms of belonging that she will be asked to negotiate and pulled between in her middle and high school experience as it unfolds over much of the arc of the novel. As Kenya imagines 40th Street as part of her neighborhood, she claims exactly the sort of belonging at the center of the subsequent 30 years of conversation about what responsibility Penn, a predominantly white institution, has to its predominantly Black neighbors in West Philadelphia. The 40th Street down which Kenya walks is one that predates the construction of New College House West, built on the lawn where students play Frisbee in Kenya's recollection. Kenya's 40th Street predates the increasing neoliberalization of Penn's campus and its surrounding blocks, the increase of the presence of Penn police both on and off campus, and the intensification and persistence of conversations about what would constitute racial and economic justice and the relation between Penn and its neighbors. Questions at the intersection of urban space, belonging, and racial and economic justice are also central to CHRISTINA JACKSON's work. In a 2019 article in the Journal of Urban Affairs on the effects of urban renewal on political and social engagement, CHRISTINA argues, quote, by analyzing political trust between residents and institutional agencies within a local historical context, we can determine how to define their fragmented engagement with the city's entities. So thinking about CHRISTINA's work and Asali's work in conversation, what is it that facilitates Kenya's trust in the fertile edge of Penn's campus? Is it really trust at all? It's certainly desire, but what is it desire for exactly? What would a future of the city organized around pursuing Kenya's trust and her desire to belong to the street where her mother works, the Walnut West Library, be like? In the article's conclusion, CHRISTINA describes the large-scale demolition and clearance processes of urban renewal as, quote, a spatial medium through which anxieties around neighborhood loss can be most clearly illustrated. It's a shared orientation to illustrating the spatial and social anxieties of loss and the kinds of desire that recast and resist both that loss and its narrativization that made me interested in having Asali and CHRISTINA in conversation. Each of their work negotiates the damage-centered geographies of loss in and of urban spaces in Philadelphia and elsewhere in conversation with geographies of desire. The sense I get as a reader of their work is that it is in the negotiation between and the nuance of these geographies in which conversations about racially and economically just urban futures inhere. CHRISTINA JACKSON, PhD, is a resident of West Philadelphia. She is an urban sociologist and scholar activist with interests in the relationships between poor and middle-class neighborhoods of color, their environments, and city entities and institutions. She takes a social justice approach by centering the stories and lives of residents through immersing herself within community struggles. CHRISTINA is a professor of sociology at Stockton University in New Jersey. CHRISTINA received her PhD from University of California, Santa Barbara, and completed her postdoctoral studies in Africana Studies at Gettysburg College. She is co-author of Embodied Difference, Divergent Bodies in Public Discourse, Lexington Books, and Black in America, The Paradox of the Color Line, Polity. She is also on the board of Camp Sojourner Girls Leadership Program and Land Health Institute. Asali Solomon is the author of The Days of Africana, a novel forthcoming from FSG in the fall. Her novel, Disgruntled, was cited as one of the best books of 2015 by the San Francisco Chronicle and the Denver Post. The short stories in her first book, Get Down, earned her a Rona Jaffe Foundation Writers Award and the National Book Foundation's 535 honor. Her writing has appeared in McSweeney's, Kenny Review, O, the Oprah Magazine, Vibe, Essence, the Paris Review Daily, and in the anthology, How We Fight White Supremacy, A Field Guide to Black Resistance. Solomon teaches fiction writing and African American and Caribbean literature at Haverford College and has become increasingly chauvinistic about being a near lifelong West Philadelphian. It is my tremendous pleasure to welcome CHRISTINA and Asali to the Kelly Writers House.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. So I'm really honored to be here for the last of this series, and I want to congratulate you, Davy, and congratulate Jessica. And also thanks to the other people working to put this event together, Heidi, Anthony, Leah. Okay, so I'm going to read from Disgruntled, and it's funny because Davy already read from the part that I was going to read. I'll still read that little part. I don't need, there's not a lot of background. This isn't the beginning of the book, so I'll just give a little background. This is set in 1980s in West Philadelphia. Kenya, who is a fifth grader at Lee School, and her mother is Sheila, who's a librarian and an activist, and her father is John Brown, and he is a sort of self-styled philosopher and a house painter. So this is he comes to pick her up from school one day. I'll just start here. One warm afternoon toward the end of fifth grade, Kenya's father arrived to pick her up from school. Outside on the steps, he crushed her to him in a way that embarrassed her. She heard a showy laugh nearby and didn't have to look up to know that it came from Letitia Simmons. She knew Letitia was probably not laughing at her father. After all, when Letitia's mother picked her up, they acted as if they'd been sold away from each other that morning. But it didn't matter what Letitia was laughing at. It just hurt that she was laughing. Kenya went stiff in her father's arms. "Hey, monkey," said John Brown. "Hi, Baba," Kenya said in a low voice. "Let me get that for you," he said, now taking her backpack. He fake stumbled. "Don't they use books anymore?" "Those are my books." "These feel like bricks," he said. "Are you taking up masonry?" Then he worked up a wan smile that Kenya knew as one pasted atop a bleak mood. Her mother referred to it irritably as his brave smile. "What's wrong?" asked Kenya. "Don't worry about me," he said. "I don't want you worrying about me." "Okay, Baba." "Well, that was a very worried sounding okay, Baba." "That's all I got," Kenya said. John Brown shook his head and laughed. "Oh, that's all you got, huh?" Then his face began drooping again. Kenya wasn't so much worried for her father as she was for herself. She did not want to watch her parents act that night. John Brown dragging his face on the floor, Sheila feigning sympathy, then moving into cold rage. Once, when Kenya had asked, "Why do you hate Baba?" her mother had responded with an open-handed slap. It was not heavy, but so surprising that it made Kenya, who was 6 at the time, explode into tears. It was the only time either one of them had hit her. "Feel like going to see your mom at her job?" he asked now, "or do you have too much homework?" Kenya loved being on 40th Street, near the Penn campus. She loved the trees and the busyness of it, the food trucks, the jewelry vendors, Marty's discount where she sometimes got small toys or a soda, the students playing frisbee on the lawn behind her mother's library. Though it was nothing like her block, all black and fairly quiet, with its aluminum-sided fronts and nearly half-mile away, she liked to think of it as part of her neighborhood. Sometimes it was fun to walk there with her father when he was in the mood to chatter about his school days or the characters he met painting houses. But heading down there from school and then walking back up to Irving Street could take a long time that would feel even longer on a warm day. It seemed breezier and calmer down by the library, brighter and sourer as they walked deeper into West Philly, especially on days when John Brown was silent. But then Kenya imagined herself trapped in the house, crouched over long division. She opted for the image of her mother in her bright silken weekday clothes, using her smooth work voice. When they reached the second floor of the library, Sheila's boss was at her mom's desk. She beamed at John Brown's approach. "Hey, Susan," he said with an expression that Kenya couldn't read. "What a nice surprise. Hi there, Kenya." Susan Zabriskie's body was a slapdash arrangement of lumps that Kenya found confusing. She had a gold tooth, floppy black hair with gray strands, and green eyes, which became extremely bright when she shined them on John Brown. Sheila sometimes teased John Brown about her boss's obvious regard for him. "Aren't you the lady killer?" she would say. "I'm about to be," he'd answer, mock waving his fist. "Hello, Mrs. Zabriskie," Kenya said, remembering too late what the woman always said when Kenya called her Mrs. "It's Ms.," said Susan Zabriskie. "Don't marry me off yet." She blushed, and John Brown made a noise headed for, but not quite arriving at, a laugh. Then he cleared his throat. Sheila went home early, sang Mrs. Zabriskie. She wasn't feeling well. Is that right? Asked John Brown. I'm afraid so, said the boss with a nonsensical laugh. Kenya found herself looking at her father out of the corner of her eye, for the first time wondering what Susan Zabriskie saw. He was not sloppy or decrepit. He wasn't much more either, just a slight man in clean clothes with somewhat sickly looking skin. The only thing distinctive about him was his beaked nose, of which Kenya's was a less severe version. That and the fact that, due to a peculiarity of his voice, he was sometimes mistaken for a girl on the phone. The question had always been how he'd snared her mother, so stylish and confident. The boss continued, Oh, I'm sure it's nothing serious. She said she had a bad headache. Say, Kenya, do you need something to read or one of the new film strips? Have you watched Really Rosie? Kenya thought about Pierre I Don't Care in The Lion's Mouth and was about to ask to see it again when her father spoke. We better go check on her mother, John Brown said. After chatting briefly about his day, more breakthroughs in the key, all reported with a kind of fake cheer, Kenya and her father walked home in the boring and unsettling silence that she had anticipated. She wouldn't ask him again what was wrong or anything else. It was too tedious. When Sheila was angry, she let you know, and she let you know why. The atmosphere around John Brown was a mist that might evaporate or turn into a rainstorm. It was as mysterious and as bothersome as bad weather. Kenya tried to lose herself in other parts of the walk by studying West Philadelphia. She gazed without comprehension at the large, neat houses near the campus painted with Greek symbols and wondered why the young white men sat shirtless on the porches. She and her father passed the Acme supermarket, where Kenya had spent many dreary hours, the stuffy laundromat they frequented before Sheila defied John Brown and bought a washer dryer on credit. They passed the delicious Koch's Deli, where Kenya's parents agreed they would never go again. After an altercation with a black customer who had left the store, the cashier had hissed to the guy making sandwiches, He doesn't know how it is. I could get him lynched. John Brown never stopped regretting that all he'd done was walk out, claiming he'd been afraid of what he might do. On days like this, Kenya noticed every pile of dog crap, every bit of trash, abandoned hug bottles, newspaper sections. She wondered why her family couldn't live closer to the campus, where the streets were orderly and cooler. Of course, she knew money and race, but still. These thoughts and her father's droopy and ominous silence made her angry. His slow shuffle reminded her of Aslan, moving slowly with Susan and Lucy to the stone table where he allowed himself to be killed. But Aslan had made a deal with the White Witch to nobly sacrifice himself for the traitor Edmund. If John Brown was sacrificing himself, what was it for? The house was in chaos. Papers and envelopes covered the floor. Winter coats from the downstairs closet were piled on the couch. Nearly half of the books seemed to be missing from the shelves. Kenya tasted terror. Her father stood behind her, gripping her shoulder. He said her name in an alarmed way, as if he was about to give her an order. Kenya wondered if he had time to get his gun, but then something changed. Oh shit, he said, moving Kenya aside and bounding up the stairs. Sheila! Sheila! Kenya followed him. They both stood at the top of the stairs where they could see Kenya's mother in her room, which looked hurricane-tossed. Sheila, who'd been known to spend hours folding underwear to pack for trips to the Jersey Shore, was throwing things in her suitcase. Sheila, said John Brown again. She did not stop what she was doing. What the fuck do you want? Kenya knew they had forgotten her. In a flash, she was looking at the closed door of her parents' bedroom. She heard the lock click. What's going on? John Brown asked. What? You know what's going on, Sheila screamed, her voice hoarse, as if she had spent the day screaming. Kenya stood in the hallway, picturing different ways to get into that room. She imagined banging on the door. She thought of falling down the stairs, but knew she couldn't do it loudly enough without seriously hurting herself. She imagined screaming her voice raw. Then it dawned on her that it didn't matter. She could hear everything they said, even though her father was speaking in a low voice. It was all wrong. Usually, John Brown was the one screaming, and Sheila was the one you could barely hear. Kenya felt the floor tipping at angles and fell in a slump against the door. I thought you didn't even like that bitch. She's not my cup of tea, you said. Remember when you said that? I should have known. You don't even say that. You don't even drink tea. Sheila, it's not what I think. Let me talk, please. Let me explain, apologize. What the fuck is the point of that? I was going to talk to you about this today. I swear, baby. I was going to talk to you about this today. How? Sheila, it's not what I wanted. You know it's not what I wanted, but I think we can work this out. Stop. They had never fought with their hands. Kenya stood up and banged on the door. Mom, Baba, Baba, she yelled. No one answered her. She heard only an occasional curse, scuffling, and a slap, a dull thud. She slid down the door and sat on the creaking wood floor. She wanted to go somewhere else in the house and ignore them, or even walk out the front door. That would show both of them, if they ever came out of that room. Their muffled voices started up again, and she covered her ears and hummed. Then she started singing all the songs she knew by heart. Songs she liked, My Cherie Amour, songs she hated, Ain't No Stopping Us Now, to which the fifth grade had to perform a humiliating dance on May Day, songs that made no sense, like Here's My Chance to Dance My Way Out of My Constrictions. She was trying to sing a solo fugue when the door whipped open and she fell backward. Kenya, her mother yelped, and then abruptly leaned down, pulling Kenya up into her arms. Her eyes were ringed with black. Kenya hadn't known she wore eye makeup. It made her cry. Shh, Sheila said. It's okay. I'm going to make dinner. Hi, monkey, her father said. He still stood in the room amid ruins. Are you going to get a divorce? Kenya mumbled into her mother's chest. I'm sorry you heard all of that, Kenya. We're all going to sit down and have dinner and talk, said Sheila. John Brown and Sheila moved stiffly about the downstairs, as if there was some danger of their touching. Kenya stood staring out of the window like TV characters did when they were thinking about something weighty, but all she could see were the boards on the windows. Sheila had gone from suggesting dinner in a calm voice to slamming pots in the kitchen, as if she just remembered reality. John Brown came over to Kenya and smoothed her cornrows. You're my life, he said, but apparently she wasn't. It seemed that John Brown Curtis and Cinda Lou Matthews, one of Sheila's closest friends, had fallen in love, and that Cinda Lou Matthews was carrying John Brown Curtis's baby, Kenya's brother or sister. At that, Sheila snorted half as they sat at the table picking over spaghetti. Don't be like that, Sheila, said John Brown. We're not like that. We're not like my mother. It seemed crazy to Kenya that John Brown was still talking. She nearly emptied the canister of powdery Parmesan cheese onto her plate, stopping only when her mother said her name sharply. So, are you going to get a divorce? Kenya asked again. Her parents looked at each other. John Brown cleared his throat. Well, now is as good a time as any to speak to you about something I wanted to ask. If Kenya had been older, she would have seen her mother's eyes fill with anticipation and the hope that whatever John Brown offered would save them all. As it was, all Kenya saw was a withering glare. Not that it mattered, given what her father said next. With your permission, Sheila and Kenya, I'd like for Cinda Lou and the baby to move in here. I'd like for us all to be a family. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Asali. That was amazing. I'll turn it over to Christina.
Right, let me just set up here and then, all right, can everyone see that? Okay, great. Okay, so hi everyone, I'm so happy to be here. Thanks again to Davy and everyone to help put this on, and I'm super excited about talking to you all about how I mostly see the topic of urban futures. It's mostly in reference to much of my work on gentrification, but more importantly, how to combat it to create healthy neighborhood ecosystems. I'm an ethnographer and have been engaged in work on gentrification and neighborhood stability in San Francisco, Atlantic City, and West Philly since 2009. And, when I was writing this talk, I realized I apologize at first. It may sound a little bleak when we all think about, the effect of capital and how it's, affected our neighborhoods and how they're changing. But I think that I'll end with some thoughts of things that we can do and ways that we could maybe chat about in the Q&A. So I'll first talk about some of the processes that affected the current state of our cities and how it affects neighborhood ecosystems. And I'll share some media and literature that I've engaged around and with in terms of the future of urban cities and, what our cities will look like if this process is not slowed down, mostly from the perspectives of Black urban residents. I first got the idea about really reflecting on the future of our cities and the future of Philadelphia from the movie The Last Black Man in San Francisco. So I'd like to show the trailer of that and how that can lead into a discussion of how to create equitable urban futures. So it kind of led me to think about these main questions. How do we create future healthy neighborhood ecosystems steeped within racialized patterns of disinvestment? And then how can low-income and Black families have a rooted future in the city of Philadelphia? So I wanted to start here. I found that these pictures were really compelling. And if you all recognize some of these, the one on the left-hand side is the aerial view of the MOVE bombing in Cobb's Creek. In the top-hand corner, it's an aerial view of urban renewal in downtown Philly, and then more recently, a picture of gentrification in Brewery Town. So I found these three pictures to be super compelling, and it reminded me that these processes, either from state violence, urban renewal, or gentrification, are all considered racialized patterns of investment with the mission of renewing neighborhoods and maintaining their appeal to investors over the last 60 years in these pictures. As we know, much of these effects have led to very deleterious outcomes that turn the wheels of pushing poor people and families of color farther and farther out of the city. And so my work in San Francisco, Atlantic City, and Philly have all taught me the same message, that urban cities are kicking out the most vulnerable communities. And so what does this do for urban neighborhoods? And I was really taken aback by the work of psychiatrist Dr. Mindy Thompson Fullilove, who's the picture of the woman on the slide. And she talked about in her book, Root Shock, this traumatic stress reaction to the destruction of all or part of one's emotional ecosystem. And if you haven't checked her work out, check it out, because it's definitely influenced my thinking. So places, buildings, cities are not just bricks that give us shelter. We're conjoined with the locations of our daily lives. It doesn't just heal overnight, but can affect generations of families and how they view their life in these spaces and their sense of options and constraints. Questions arise for me about how to create rooted futures for urban low-income communities of color. And she talks about how urban renewal and other processes like these have contributed to what she calls a collective loss, or a loss of a massive web of connections and a way of being that has essentially been destroyed by trends like urban renewal. And I just wanted to read from two pieces from her book. The first is her discussing what happens when trees are yanked from the ground. So trees yanked from the ground lose important parts of their root system. The delicate root hairs which connect the root to the earth are largely stripped off, as are the tips of the larger and deeper roots. When their delicate roots are injured by such rough treatment, trees struggle to get water and nourishment. They pass through the chancy period of root shock. Like any organism in shock from drastic psychological change, a tree in shock hangs between life and death. Trees need the roots. People too need roots. Human communities like the tree cannot produce their crown without the massive network of connections that move nourishment from the earth to the entire organism of the group. The evil of urban renewal is that the people were stripped of their roots and forced without aid to struggle through the period of shock to replant themselves as best they might. And so that analogy really informed my work when I was in graduate school. And I began to think about neighborhoods as ecosystems and about things in these neighborhoods and homes and places we know as being trees. And so, as you all know, I was going to do this talk about what is gentrification, but I'm sure we all are very aware of what gentrification is. So I really want to focus on what happens if this continues to go at the pace that things have been going. So as you know, this has been happening all over. It's not, of course, a Philadelphia story. And in many ways, it's really interesting, just as a quick aside, that, you know, when I started my work on San Francisco, when I was doing my graduate work, I didn't realize that I was studying one of the most like rapid, insane forms of gentrification, right? And then I come to Atlantic City, which is like very, very much in the very beginning phases of gentrification. And then Philadelphia just hovers nice in the middle, right? So I was reading a lot from a book by an anthropologist, Sam Stein, called Capital City, Gentrification, and the Real Estate State. I don't know if you all have checked out this book, but he details out a kind of darker view of where we are. So I'll just lay that out really quick. Who is the angel of death? Who is the mass murderer? Today, as a century ago, the culprit is capital, rushing in and out of spaces with abandon in search of profit and growth. In 1911, the arsonist was industrial capital, and then the dominant force in urban politics. In 2017, it was real estate capital. Around the world, more and more money is being invested in real estate, the business of building, buying, and renting land and property. You could sense it as you walk through most cities and feel it every time you pay the rent or mortgage. I'll skip around just a bit. In the United States, homes are changing hands at a rapid pace, but home ownership is at a 50-year low. In 2016, a record 37% of home sales were made to absentee investors. As renting rises, so do rents. Average move-in rents in the United States have more than doubled over the last 2 decades. Prices vary dramatically across the country, but the trend is clearly upward, with the fastest growth in now mid-sized cities like Seattle, Portland, Denver, and Cincinnati. Wages, however, remain stagnant, putting tenants in a bind. There is not a single county in the country where a full-time wage worker can afford the average 2-bedroom apartment. With wages flat, many people, even those with full-time jobs, simply can't afford stable housing. Last year, as cities and states continued to pass punitive legislation against the poor, about 2 million people in the US went homeless and 7 million more lived in precarious housing situations. So Stein lays out, again, a very bleak view of the city that, you know, we can see these processes of very rapid gentrification taking hold, right? But we aren't in New York and we aren't in SF, we're here. And I think that we have the kind of potential to make these type of changes to reflect a very different urban future. But it also got me thinking of a more cinematic view of like the future of Philadelphia. And it's shown in the film about the healing and trauma of our cities and what an equitable future can look like. And in particular, The Last Black Man in San Francisco is a movie that I think shows that really well in a very futuristic way, speeding up the city to a place where low-income people of color and Black folks in particular are pushed out so dramatically that there are few left. And just to give you all just a heads up about this movie. So this movie follows the story of Jimmy Fails. It's actually a true story of Jimmy Fails, a young San Franciscan Black man with a history of eviction and living in group homes, as well as addiction in his family. He goes on a trek with his friend in the back to save his old home in what is now a very ritzy, gentrified part of the city. And his quest to not be displaced out of the city he calls his home. He actually attempts to try to buy this home, right? And, you know, that tends to be very far from his reality due to not having money to buy an over $1 million home. And the film questions what happens to people like him. So I wanted to just play this very quickly.
We built these ships, dredged these canals in the San Francisco they never knew existed. This is our home. You two stick together.
I always come back to the old house. What if it's empty? What if we just peeked inside?
We could throw parties. You could put on one of your plays. We could yell.
Where is this house?
Our old house.
That's not your old house, and that's not your neighborhood.
Hey, if you're going to San Francisco, be sure to wear flowers in your hair.
Maybe he's right. What if we shouldn't be here? Well, we should be here more.
Some millionaire?
If you leave, it's not your loss. It's San Francisco.
I don't know how much longer we can keep doing this.
But I'm not leaving. I'm the last one left.
I'm with you, brother.
All right. So yeah, I thought that movie really got me thinking in terms of like what would happen if these forces that are playing out in urban cities in Philadelphia, especially Philadelphia, are sped up to this point where, you know, Black residents can no longer live in the city anymore. So I wanted to share with you all some of the narratives that I hear in the 3 cities that I've done work in that reveal, and this one in particular reveal a kind of puppetry-like feeling of living in the city and not having control over what happens. So this resident, Ms. Laura, said, people of color are told where they could live. Now it appears someone has changed their mind and now want us to live not only somewhere else, but some other way. So, you know, to me, I got this image of like this overarching force of like hand of capital, right? That is basically kind of, you know, playing out and determining Miss Laura's life living in the city. All the way back in San Francisco, in this passage, Kevin talked about a kind of temporary feeling that he has living in the city. So he said, when I asked him about urban renewal and gentrification, it said that it showed that a city would use eminent domain to destroy what was a vibrant community, however poor, a vibrant community. And also sent a signal to Black people, a long-lasting symbol, because it's lasted about 40 years now, that Black folk weren't really part of the fabric and will uproot you and move you out with great promises to move you back in if we have to. And so to me, I feel like it also, you know, again, way across the other coast, we still feel and hear the same feelings, right, about residents in their neighborhoods. And so what can we do about this future? And how can we work on creating neighborhoods in which, as Dr. Fully Love reminds us, in which we can dwell together? And she talks about how we can work to create these neighborhoods that are stable, right? That are diverse, that builds on and needs work and advocacy that kind of levels out the playing field for other residents in the city. And so she says and ends on this note in her book, as a public health psychiatrist, I believe that healing a group psyche occurs from a collective process that requires organizing ways in which people can come together, learn facts, share ideas, raise questions, and search for solutions. And, you know, she's advocating for a very different kind of framing current issues like gentrification. And I wanted to read just lastly from another piece from her book. And when she talks about, she gives us insight for how to think about what's happening today and plays with this idea of time and space. If we think of the there and then of the past, we speak with the knowledge of the meanings that the past had for us. If we think of the there and then of the future, we speak from our present longing to be free of burdens we are hard pressed to manage. Thus, past, present, and future are concerned with different kinds of knowing, and each of these is true and useful and incomplete. When people are able to shift from one part of the picture to another, they typically do so by focusing on different parts. Some parts come into the foreground, while other parts recede into the background. In this division of awareness into need to know and don't need to know, we split the present into parts. We remain aware of the dysfunctional, but lose sight of the functional. This is a good strategy for staying alive, but it has costs in terms of the holistic awareness of the present. And, in terms of that kind of holistic awareness of the present, any work that we need to do in order to preserve our communities to not become a New York or San Francisco means that our policy and advocacy work needs to think broadly and deeply about how development work needs to be based in equity, how to protect existing residents and create healthy neighborhood ecosystems that sustain themselves. And it starts with existing residents envisioning their communities and having those conversations together. And I was so lucky to help to organize the gentrification and King Sessing group here in West Philly. And we've been doing precisely what Dr. Fullilove has encouraged us to have these collective conversations in which we meet one another, share facts about what we know and raise questions and search for solutions. And so that picture in the upper right-hand corner is a picture of our first meeting in which we had, I lost count, but it was like over 70 people in the bottom floor of the King Sessing Library. It was amazing, young, old, all different colors. It was an amazing sight. And COVID obviously impacted that, and we've had a number of virtual meetings, but the heat is there, right? That many people come into a room at 2:00 on a Saturday when it was nice out. I mean, that means people are really, really invested in this. So as what I learned from those kind of conversations, as well as ones across the nation, are that to preserve equitable futures, we must do several things. And so, I wanted to kind of, end the talk and, hope for more discussion, but around some tangible things that we can do and that I've been engaged in with other community residents. And so on the ground level, I feel, and, this is all my opinion, but on the ground level, I feel that residents need to be building more community power and learning the facts, arming themselves with the policies and protections that they fight to advocate for, right? So our January meeting was talking about the history of redlining and how the neighborhoods that were redlined have the highest rates of homicides today. Like that's crazy, right? Redlining isn't a thing anymore, but yet how the neighborhood was rated in the 1930s, right, aligns with how many acts of violence that they have in the neighborhood, right? So that, the impact is clear. At the same time, and another thing we did also was just like learn about like MOUs and these type of community benefits agreements and things like that. At the same time, in my opinion, a lot of these business friendly only policies like tax abatements, or even pilots. I know Penn's been doing some really good work around pushing for pilots. Things like tax abatements need to be severely curtailed as it takes away money from public schools, which contribute to neighborhood stability as well. Small business-friendly policies can also aid in helping to stabilize neighborhoods, as well as more mixed, type of housing. So low-income housing, middle-income housing, and higher-income housing. So in my view, and I'll just end here to discuss some of these ideas, but when communities know which protections they need to demand, which amenities to add to deals with developers, as well as like cracking down on more policies that invest in neighborhood stability, rather than just the business community, gentrification could be slowed down some over time. The goal here to me is that the future of these neighborhoods are to create and maintain strong neighborhoods with like a good economic environment, but not one that displaces poor people of color and continues to kind of polarize or create an environment in which that's very polarizing for the rich and the poor, as well as the middle class. So I'll end there. Thank you, and I'm excited to hear what folks are thinking.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Christina. It was so lovely to hear that presentation, and amazing to hear the two of y'all present one after another. There are so many connections. And so I want to start by inviting folks who are watching in the YouTube feed to put questions in the feed so that they can be addressed. And also, I wanted to start by asking the two of you if you have questions for each other, in hearing each other talk about racialized practices of neighborhood change in West Philadelphia from two really different perspectives. I wanted to ask if y'all had questions for each other.
I do have a question. Because I've been thinking of like, so I'm from Philadelphia. I lived away from here for 20 years and came back. And obviously it's very, very different. But then about a year ago, when the lockdown started, people started making a lot of noise about how, everybody was going to move back to the suburbs. Christina, are you seeing, like, what do you think as somebody who watches cities? Do you think COVID will actually slow down gentrification, or was that just like a buzzy thing to, this most recent experience of lockdowns? What do you think about that? Do you think that'll affect the patterns?
That's a good question. It's hard to say. I'll just say that right now I'm actually in the process of selling my home, as some people may know, and that hasn't been a problem. And so I just know that just personally, it seems like people are still buying and selling. Are you just talking about like the process of just like buying and selling, and if that's like still increased
No,
during
it's
this
like
time
that
post-COVID?
gentrification is happening so rapidly, but a year ago there was all this talk about how people were fleeing, people with the means were fleeing cities. And
Oh, I
so
see.
the question is, will that be, if you feel like that will actually leave a mark, or if that will just reset itself, or.
Yeah, that's a good point. I did hear of a little bit of that, especially last year. But to me, I feel like, you know, I tend to follow like what the path of capital, right? And so I know that capital in large amounts are coming back to the city and not out in the suburbs in that particular way. So I feel like there's still going to be these kind of intensified processes, like even post-COVID. Rates are like super low right now. So like people are like buying and selling. And so for me, yeah, and political geographers kind of do that too, where they kind of think about just the direction of capital and where that's headed. And it's definitely heading toward these type of neighborhoods. So I think that COVID may like trouble that process some, but I would think that things would get back up and running too. It's a very bleak answer. I wish they could be more positive, but yeah.
And it looks like we have a question also from the YouTube feed. J.Lo Rhodes asks, can you talk more about redefining low income, and mentions this research is so robust?
Yes, absolutely. So that was something that came out of the gentrification kinksessing groups that we formed. We didn't come necessarily with any like specific ideas, and then residents created themselves different groups that they felt we need to have conversations about. And one of them was redefining what low income means. And so, a lot of like developments have these buzzwords like, oh, it's affordable housing, right? It's low income housing, right? And all those buzzwords sound great, right? My ears will perk up. But when you look into some of these developments and you kind of, look around and you see what they're, looking at for like their AMI and all these different terms, you'll see that like, are they defining someone that's low income as someone that could make like $50,000? And obviously I know that depends on family size and all those type of things. But in general, I'm like, so like, that's something that I feel like residents and all of us need to just like look more closely at too. I mean, if they're actually providing low income housing that's actually for people that are making under $30,000 a year, right? Then that's okay. But I think that in some of these cases, you'll have some of these developments that may say that they have affordable housing, but it's really for, middle class folks, right? And middle class folks are also being squeezed out. We're all being squeezed out. But I feel like, especially families that just have, one income. But, obviously I think it's important to focus on those who are, in the most vulnerable positions. But yeah, I would say redefining low income that actually means low income based off of like the median of what people are making in Philadelphia.
We have another question from the YouTube feed from Christian Hayden, who asks, the emotional lives of the people who live in a place are part of the physical environments of neighborhoods. How do we get everyone to see that, from policymakers, developers, and police? And because I think of each of you as being engaged with thinking about the emotional lives of cities, if both of you had thoughts about this, I'd be super curious to know what they are. And maybe even to add to Christian's question, what is the role of talking about the emotional lives of gentrification in thinking about equitable forms of change?
Christina?
Well, I mean, Christian's a friend of mine. I mean, that's the $1 million question. I mean, that's what I'm trying to do is have these conversations together, and not have it be, these are just the economic impacts. These are just the social impacts. Like this is just the historical impact. Like, I think the whole point is that these conversations need to be had together. And so I have no good answer for that. That's what I'm trying to get at a little bit.
I mean, it's kind of interesting. Like when I read a question like that, I'm like, does a developer know anything about the emotional life of anyone? Like that doesn't seem, I mean, I often think about the way how developers, by the time they make their money, like they're gone, they're gone, right? And then we're just dealing with it. But it's also interesting when you say police, because I feel like nationally and internationally, the police got a lot of insight into the emotional lives of a lot of people in this past year in a way that maybe they had not before, with the massive sort of worldwide protests against police murder. And I mean, you obviously don't want emotional life to just mean extreme suffering for hundreds of years. But those, the sort of uprising and protests, like that's a good example of emotional life that no one was listening to for or not no one, but, very few people in power were listening to for a really long time.
Yeah, I'll just also say, since David reminded me of that article that I wrote about trust, I think trust plays a lot into this too. And I think that trust is the kind of thing that brings all of those areas together, right? I think that, or at least what I've seen, is that neighborhoods, many times when you have these like new like plans, and they're just saying it's going to be different than the past, it's not going to, displace you. Residents are just like, like they're thinking about the racial hierarchy of the United States. They're thinking about the role that capital plays in their neighborhood, right? And capitalism. And they're like, I hear what you're saying, but I'm going off of what has happened in the past, right? What has really, really changed. And so I think it makes it really, really tricky when thinking about the kind of positions that everyone comes from and how they think about this topic. But we know that, in a lot of predominantly Black neighborhoods, a lot of residents already felt like the deck is already stacked against them. So in order to heal from that, we all need like transparency, discussions, like actual measurable like things that, grants and home buying grants, like I needed that in order to be able to buy my home. And I hear that program's now on hold. I mean, folks like me that like needed that to buy a house are unable to buy a home. Like those type of like grants and funding should be poured into these neighborhoods to try to stabilize them and create more opportunities. So how to get folks to be able to hear that from different positions, I think is pretty tough.
And I have a follow-up related to that, but I want to get to Alyssa's question first. Alyssa Wise asks, curious about the role of public education in accelerating or slowing gentrification as you see it in Philly, since that's part of Kenya's story in your book, Asali, and your work, Christina.
I mean, I don't know, like, do we have 6 hours to, to address the question of public education with regard to gentrification? I mean, I think, I don't even know, it's hard to even, I mean, it's so interesting to me the way that this works, which is that, and so I was interested in Christina in your, ending your talk by talking about things that people could do. And really the idea of sustained discussions with a cross section of people in a community is so important, because I really have begun to think that, like, if there's an underfunded school that has resources but a lot of issues as a result of being underfunded, the more that's addressed, the more rich people will come to the neighborhood, and then the school will be rich and white eventually, and like just feeling like that's just how that it's almost like it almost seems to be like a law of physics at this point. And so I don't know, we're still trying to figure out ways to intervene in that with regard to neighborhoods generally, and certainly with regard to schools. It's like when you talk about improving school, if a school really becomes improved, do the people of color, working class, poor people of color still get to go to that school? I don't know.
Yeah, I'll just say, I don't really look at public education in my research, but in the other hat I wear as a parent and a member of the SACET League, I think I don't know if public education is accelerating or slowing it, as more that I think how public education is changing and being affected by gentrification, right? So, a lot of these new public school, not new public schools, but a lot of these public schools like Lee or Powell, a lot of their younger grades, right, are a lot more white than the upper grades, right? Because a lot of that, just what, Asali is saying. And so I think that like the role of like SACs and school advisory committees and doing that work, which, Asali's mom, I met through doing that work at Powell too. How do you like bring the much needed resources to these neighborhood schools, but also get them to pay attention to the other ones that aren't gentrifying, right? So that's the work that like we're trying to do by resurrecting West Philadelphia Coalition for Neighborhood Schools. How do we make it so that like the schools that are closest to Penn, right, don't just get most of the resources, and places like my mom's school farther in West Philly, make sure that they get the same type of resources that our schools are getting as well, right? So I think that public education is a good place to test that out, right, and really try to do that type of equity work. So yeah, that's what I'm hoping.
I have a question that's kind of in conversation with this, and there's a train behind my house, so I'm going to compete with the train for a minute, which is like so dramatic. I might actually just let the train do its thing.
Actually, I can hear you totally.
You can hear me. Okay, cool. So my question is, so something that I was so struck by, Christina, in your presentation was the metaphor of rootedness. And something that I'm always curious about is that, like, my experience of variously social science oriented urbanist scholars is that they really need metaphors in order to be able to talk about cities. Because like a city is messily a built environment and a set of policies and like a set of feelings that are inextricable, and a set of kinship relationships that are inextricable from the built environment and the policies. So I want to ask both of you kind of a messy question that's like the question that I think about every day and have my whole life, which is like, how do you write about all of the things a city is simultaneously? And like, what kind of language do you find yourself going toward to be able to get at a city as like both the space where things are happening and as like a entity that's like larger and more intense than its built environment, that like is a kind of kinship relation, is like almost like a family member?
Yeah, I was going to say, I just wanted to piggyback and just say that I had that question for your work, Asali. So I'm interested to hear what you have to say about that.
Just like capturing the city, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I guess I haven't. So everything that I've written has been about Philadelphia pretty much, and like I haven't really. It's an interesting thing to step back from and think about what it means to write about a city, because it's mainly what I do, and I've written about the main line as well as a sort of space of absence and lack in a way. But I think that like it's the way that I often represent it is, first of all, by trying to like think about all of the different characters in anything as having their own story. that there's something deeply city about that to me, so that even if somebody just walks on and is like a minor character, the reader can imagine what their life is, you know? And also just by trying to capture as much as possible a sense of all of the different kinds of people and all the different competing motivations that you might come across. So like, you know, in the part I just read, just like when Kenya walks by the frat houses, you know, just like you can sort of think for a minute, okay, well, what, you know, what is going on there? Or even the little mini anecdote about Koch's, which is based on something true. Just, oh yeah. No, my family broke up with Koch's.
Never again, never again.
And then when I came back to the city 10 years ago, I tried to sneak back, and then something else happened. I was like, we had to break up again, but it is delicious. So the, you know, so a sense of that, but also I feel like only recently, you know, one of the things I don't really do in fiction, and I could stand to do much more of it, is describe things like trees, because I don't like know the names of trees. But I think that there's something very city about the fact that I always know what music is playing in the background, always know what music is going by in a car, like people's clothing, people's like the kind of choices people make as like consumers of art and consumers of culture are always really heavily in my writing. And in some ways, that's kind of like the geography of the city for me in some ways. So those are some of my ideas.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, Davy, and I also think about it constantly all the time. And what I've come to is the term ecosystem. I really like that. And I tend to, so my, you know, my dissertation work was literally on Bayview Hunters Point, which was in The Last Black Man in San Francisco, but the environmental justice issues. So if you all see in the beginning of the film, it's just so deep about how there's this reverend who's like preaching and everyone, you know, acts like he's just this crazy guy and he's not saying anything substantial, but he's pointing out the fact that the people that are cleaning up the shipyard are wearing hazmat suits while residents are just walking around. And he's pointing out the fact that the fish have like 3 eyes and like these like things. And I'm just like, wow. And so I tend to look at city neighborhoods in a more kind of environmental way as well, and think about the ecosystem as everything impacting everything and everything having their different like ways of getting there. And if you put this development or you know, have this issue of state violence, you know, Westfield is a great example, okay, in terms of like, you know, the MOVE bombing and, you know, where Walter Wallace was murdered, the 52nd Street uprisings, you know, all those things affect one another. And we can't think of those things as being siloed, right? And we can't think of these neighborhoods without understanding the past history, right? And constraints and what 52nd Street used to be, right? I was just having a conversation yesterday when I was like picking up trash around my house, and, you know, this older woman just came up and started talking to me up here in Cobbs Creek. You know, she just offered, I didn't even ask, right? I'm just like, you must know I'm a, you know, that I study this, but I didn't even ask, literally. And she was just talking about how this corner used to have this business, this corner used to have this business, and everyone, and maybe it's a tell young folk in the neighborhood type of thing, but literally every conversation I have, people are always talking to me about what this neighborhood used to be and how the businesses used to be in these particular places and how it was like so diverse. And I'm beginning to realize that that's just kind of like how they get through their day, like looking at this and hoping that this is like temporary, and that things will get back to a place where they felt like more empowered in their neighborhoods, at least in Cobbs Creek, I'll just say. So I think like the ecosystem metaphor really helps us to be able to capture these type of things in a way that I just haven't found a better term. You know, environment doesn't do it, because when we just think of the environment, we just think of the built environment, right? But it still doesn't get this like depth that like Dr. Fuller Love is really talking about, like history and policies and how that like all comes together to create like how we think of, you know, today's world. So yeah, I would say ecosystem is a good term for me.
Awesome. It's so great to hear y'all both talk about that. It's such a like urgent and simultaneously unanswerable question, and its urgent and unanswerableness means we like all get to work on it forever, in like really different ways. Do y'all have any other questions for each other? Also, folks watching on YouTube, if y'all have any other questions, we could take them now. Other stuff on your mind?
The other thing I was just thinking about as you were talking about ecosystems and environmental justice is certainly this issue of climate catastrophe is also an interesting thing to consider with regard to the trajectory of gentrification. And I remember it was like a year or so ago. No, it was like maybe 2 years ago. I read this thing and it was like extremely sort of obvious but horrifying, which was that in Miami, the residents of Little Haiti were being displaced because they're on high ground. And, years ago, that was undesirable in Miami. You wanted to be on the coast. But now, and so thinking about gentrification going, and this is hewing to, environmental justice stories that have already been around for years, but the idea of like who, not even just like where you want to live or if you have access to things, but who lives and who drowns, sort of following the gentrification patterns is another, like a very dramatic way of thinking about a lot of this stuff. And it's kind of contemporary. I mean, what about Atlantic? It's interesting to me also that you said Atlantic City is gentrifying. Like, how does that work?
Yeah, that's a good point. So Atlantic City is just in the very, very kind of beginning type of phases. There's a whole long history about the stigma of Atlantic City, and they're trying to resurrect Tennessee Ave, and they're trying to create this what they call Orange Loop, if you all Google it. And they said that they're trying to mirror it off of South Street in Philadelphia, which is really interesting if you like go to where this is actually in the city right now. But I think that like what you're talking about is really important too. And I didn't even catch that. So like in San Francisco, like where you saw in that film, Bayview Hunters Point is one of the highest points in the city, and it has the best views of the bay. And so that probably plays into like this new renewed interest in kind of redeveloping that neighborhood because it's a little farther away from downtown. And then in Atlantic City, Atlantic City was hit very intensely by Sandy. And so some of the work I've done with my students has been on Sandy recovery, and just the fact that, the sea level is rising, and a lot of residents are really concerned about that. And a lot of fixed income residents that I talk to are really concerned about how hot things are getting, right? And so there's kind of like an economic issue, there's like a literal environmental climate issue, and then about, again, taking, a page from the Hurricane Katrina book, like thinking about how these neighborhoods are or are not protected, right? For future disaster is really, really important. Because Philadelphia is so, inland, I don't hear that type of concern there, but I do hear the concern about heat and like, urban heat islands and the lack of trees in particular areas that make it a lot hotter, as well as then these issues about being on a fixed income and, seniors just saying that it's just getting hotter and my AC bills are getting like higher and higher and higher. So I think those are, really relevant concerns.
But also, I was very interested to see that you did work on San Francisco. I went to Berkeley for grad school, and so I was in North Oakland for 6 years. And I mean, I knew sort of vaguely or anecdotally that there were Black people in San Francisco, but they were so not a presence, in San Francisco. And so thinking about the history of how that came to be is just, I don't know, just kind of interesting to me.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're absolutely right. And that's why I was drawn to the project and drawn to that movie, because, the Black population in San Francisco just goes down and down and down. And my master's research was exactly on that. It was on Black out migration out the city, right? So many are going to like Oakland, or, Oakland's now like the kind of big hub, and they're moving out to the city because it's just getting too expensive for them to live there. And a lot of folks, when they think of, Black urban cities, they don't think of San Francisco, but it used to be a very significant part of the history. But now they're being evicted, they're being chased out, they can't afford it, and they just want more bang for their buck outside of San Francisco, and they could just take BART over. So I think that's kind of like, the Bay Area rapid transit system. So like our SEPTA. so that's becoming like a better option for them now.
And even Oakland.
Yeah, Oakland
Right.
too, yeah.
Really intense. Yeah.
Other things on your mind? This has been totally amazing. I was so excited to have the two of y'all in conversation, and it's really been awesome. So thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your work. This has been such a great conversation.
Davy, can you tell us about your research?
Sure. So it will come as no surprise that I think about urban futures. And I think specifically about queer and trans relationships to climate futures, basically thinking about what queer, trans, and critical race theory as like a long archive of scholarship good at thinking about alternate futures gives us for thinking about climate change and thinking about those archives of thinking about sort of non-white cis heterosexual futures as actually really useful if we think about the fact that climate change makes time weird and makes progress weird, and thinking about at a moment where folks are trying to think about like what will the spatial logics of adjusting to climate change be, like how will we think about space differently, sort of being like, well, like actually people have been thinking about this for a really long time, not necessarily in environmental terms, but this is absolutely environmental thinking. What kind of climate models do we get, and what kind of like cross-disciplinary conversation do we get, thinking about scholarship on alternate futures as relevant to environmental justice. So I was especially delighted to get to hear y'all talk about urban futures. Cool. Well, thanks so much everyone for being here. Thank you again, Asali and Christina. And thanks Jessica and everyone at the KWH for making the series possible over the past 5 years.
Thank you, Davy. This was awesome. Great to be in conversation with you too, Asali.
Yeah. Thank you.